July 19th, 1943. The apartment door splinters inward as 6 Gestapo agents storm through. 25-year-old Niuta Teitelbaum reaches for the cyanide capsule hidden in her dress pocket. Her fingers touch the small vial. She's carried it for exactly this moment, rehearsed this final act 100 times in her mind. But she's too slow. A German hand clamps around her wrist before the poison reaches her lips. The blonde girl with braids who terrorized Nazi headquarters for 18 months, who walked into SS command posts and executed officers at their desks. He became the most wanted Jewish woman in Warsaw, with a bounty of 150,000 złotys on her head, has finally run out of luck. The Gestapo agents stare at her in disbelief. This is little Wanda with the braids, the assassin they've hunted across Warsaw for more than a year. She looks like a 16-year-old Polish farm girl. Blue eyes, blonde hair tied in 2 long braids, a face so innocent that Nazi guards regularly let her into restricted areas, assuming she was some officer's pregnant girlfriend coming to discuss a delicate matter. What they don't know yet, what they won't learn, even after weeks of torture designed to break human beings, is the full scope of what this slight young woman accomplished. Between 1942 and 1943, Niuta assassinated at least 7 to 10 German officers and soldiers. She bombed a Nazi cinema in central Warsaw. She smuggled weapons into the sealed ghetto where 460,000 Jews starved behind 10-foot walls. She fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that held off German tanks and artillery for 27 days, with almost no weapons. The story you're about to hear was buried for nearly 80 years. Not because it wasn't documented, but because historians systematically ignored women's resistance work, because communist affiliations made heroes uncomfortable during the Cold War, because the clandestine nature of assassination operations left gaps that scholars claimed made stories unreliable, because a young Jewish woman who looked like a doll and killed like a soldier didn't fit anyone's narrative of how victims should behave. Her name appears in a few scattered Holocaust histories, a paragraph here, a footnote there. But what she actually did, how she did it, and why it mattered has remained hidden until very recently. This is the story of how a 22-year-old who looked 16 became one of the most effective Jewish resistance fighters of World War II, and why it took 80 years for anyone to care. Niuta Tajtelbaum was born on October 31st, 1917, in Lodz, Poland. Her family was traditional Hasidic, deeply religious, observant of every Jewish law and custom. But Niuta, as she came to be known, rejected orthodoxy almost from the moment she could think for herself. While her family prayed, she argued. While they followed tradition, she questioned everything. By high school, she joined illegal communist youth groups. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was 1930s Poland, where communism could get you arrested, beaten, or worse. Her school expelled her for political activities. Most young people would have backed down, kept their heads low, played it safe. Niuta doubled down. She fought her way to Warsaw University, studying history and psychology at a time when Polish universities barely admitted Jewish women. Everything she'd worked for, every dream she'd had about her future, ended the moment Nazi boots crossed the border. The invasion took 27 days. By October, Poland no longer existed as a sovereign nation. The Nazis divided the country between Germany and the Soviet Union. Warsaw fell under direct German occupation, and the nightmare began immediately. In November 1940, the Germans sealed the Warsaw Ghetto. 460,000 Jews, roughly 30% of Warsaw's entire population, were crammed into just 1.3 square miles. That's less than 3% of the city's total area. The math is staggering. 7.2 to 9.2 people per room. Families sharing single beds in shifts. Starvation rations of 1,125 calories per day, far below what human beings need to survive. The ghetto wasn't a neighborhood. It was an open-air extermination camp. Between October 1940 and July 1942, before the mass deportations to Treblinka even began, approximately 83,000 to 92,000 Jews died. That's 20% of the ghetto population. They died of starvation, disease, exposure, and despair. Every morning, bodies of those who'd starved overnight lined the streets. People stepped over corpses on their way to bread lines. This was the world Niuta entered when the ghetto walls went up. She was 23 years old, newly educated, and facing the systematic murder of her entire people. Most people would have focused on survival, on getting enough food for today, enough warmth for tonight. Niuta started planning how to kill Nazis. Here's what made Niuta different from almost every other Jewish resistance fighter. She looked Aryan. Not kind of Aryan, not passing in dim light with the right papers. She looked like the Nazi propaganda posters. Blonde hair, blue eyes, fair complexion, delicate features. At 22, she looked 16. Witnesses described her as doll-like, as looking like a naive Polish farm girl who'd just come from the countryside. This wasn't just fortunate. This was the difference between life and death, between effectiveness and uselessness. Jewish men could be identified immediately by circumcision. If Nazis caught a Jewish man on the Aryan side of Warsaw, they'd pull down his pants and shoot him on the spot. Jewish women with dark features, with similar noses or eyes, faced the same fate. But Niuta could walk through Nazi checkpoints without a second glance. She could approach German soldiers without triggering suspicion. She could enter areas where any identifiable Jew faced instant execution. Her appearance was an accident of genetics. What she did with it was deliberate genius. The resistance needed her immediately. The Jewish Combat Organization, the Job, formed on July 28, 1942, 6 days after the Nazis began what they called the Great Deportation. This was the systematic murder of Warsaw's Jews at Treblinka. Between July and September 1942, the Germans transported 254,000 to 300,000 people to the death camp and murdered them in gas chambers. Every day, thousands of Jews were rounded up in the ghetto. German soldiers and their Ukrainian auxiliaries would surround blocks, force everyone into the streets, select who would be deported that day. Children were torn from parents' arms. The elderly were beaten if they couldn't walk fast enough. Everyone knew where the trains were going, even if they didn't know the exact method of murder. The word Treblinka became synonymous with death. The Zob started with one pistol. 1. Their leader, Mordecai Anielewicz, was 24 years old, younger than Niuta. The organization represented a coalition of 5 Jewish political movements who'd spent years fighting each other over ideology. Socialists, communists, Bundists, Zionists, and labor Zionists had disagreed about everything before the war. They'd published competing newspapers, held rival meetings, recruited from each other's membership. The Nazis gave them a common enemy, and survival required cooperation. They had no weapons, no training, no outside support. The Polish underground, the Home Army, refused to provide significant assistance to Jewish resistance groups. Anti-Semitism didn't disappear just because the Nazis were worse. Some Poles helped Jews, risking their lives to hide families or smuggle food. But institutional support from the Polish resistance was minimal at best, hostile at worst. What the Job had was fury and desperation. They knew they were going to die. The only question was whether they'd die in gas chambers at Treblinka or fighting in the streets of Warsaw. For most of them, that wasn't really a question at all. Niuta didn't just join the Job. She also worked with the Guardia Ludowa, the Communist People's Guard. Dual affiliation was unusual but not unheard of in a ghetto. When you're facing extinction, political purity matters less than killing the people trying to murder you. The Guardia Ludowa made her deputy commander of their combat unit. They put her in the Spetsgruppe, a special assassination squad targeting high-value Nazi officers. Think about what that means. A 22-year-old woman, in a culture where women weren't supposed to fight, was given command authority and assassination assignments by hardened communist fighters. They trusted her not because they were being nice, not because of quotas or gender equality. They trusted her because she'd proven she could walk into Nazi headquarters and kill people without flinching. Her tactics were brilliant in their simplicity. She'd braid her blonde hair in 2 long plaits, exactly the way Polish peasant girls wore their hair. He'd tie a kerchief around her head. She'd approach Nazi command posts or Gestapo offices looking shy and embarrassed. When guards stopped her, she'd blush, look down at her feet, and say she needed to see an officer about a personal matter. The Germans understood immediately. Personal matter meant pregnancy. It meant some German soldier or officer had seduced a Polish girl, gotten her pregnant, and now she was coming to discuss the awkward situation. Nazi ideology promoted German men impregnating Slavic women as a way to Germanize the East. Guards had seen this scenario countless times. Young Polish women, often barely adults, coming to demand support or marriage, or at least acknowledgement from German soldiers who'd used them. The guards would grin, make crude jokes among themselves, and wave her through. They'd make comments about their comrades' conquests, about the officer's virility, about what the girl must have been like in bed. The shy farm girl would smile sweetly, thank them politely, and walk into areas where any known Jew would be shot on sight without trial or question. Once inside, the transformation was instantaneous. The shy girl would pull a pistol from beneath her dress and shoot her target, usually at close range, often with a silenced weapon. Silences weren't perfect. They didn't make gunshots silent like in movies, but they reduced the sound enough that in a busy headquarters with typewriters clacking and people talking, a shot might sound like a door slamming or furniture being moved. Then she'd compose herself, tuck the gun away, and walk back out past the same guards who'd let her in. She'd offer a sweet smile, a little wave of thanks, maybe wipe her eyes as if she'd been crying during her conversation with the officer. The guards would see a girl who'd just had a difficult discussion about her pregnancy, who was upset and vulnerable. None of them saw a Jewish assassin who'd just executed their superior officer meters away. Her most audacious operation happened at a Gestapo apartment on Śmielna Street in central Warsaw. She entered the building, shot 3 Gestapo agents, killing 2 and wounding 1. Most resistance fighters would have fled immediately after that kind of assault. Niuta wasn't finished. She somehow obtained a physician's white coat. She infiltrated the hospital where the wounded Gestapo agent was being treated. She located his room, walked past the police officer guarding him, and shot both the wounded agent and the guard. 5 Nazi personnel killed in a single operation, because 1 wasn't enough. In 1943, she killed 5 Nazi soldiers in a single day. Think about what that requires. Not just the courage to kill, but the operational security to plan 5 separate assassinations, execute all 5 successfully, and escape every time. Each encounter was potentially her last. Each German she approached could have recognized her, could have been the one who'd seen her face on wanted posters, could have been faster with their weapon. The Gestapo gave her a nickname that would haunt them. Little Wanda with the braids. They put a bounty of 150,000 złotys on her head. That was an enormous sum in occupied Warsaw, enough money to live comfortably for years. Poles who collaborated with the Germans could have retired on that reward. But somehow, despite every Nazi in Warsaw hunting her, despite the massive bounty, despite being on every most wanted list, she remained free for 18 months. Her work wasn't limited to assassination. On January 17, 1943, she successfully bombed the Kamerlichtspiele cinema on Marszałkowska Street. This was a Germans-only theater where Nazi soldiers went to relax, to watch propaganda films, to feel safe and entertained. Niuta made sure they never felt safe again. She smuggled revolvers into the ghetto, weapons that were worth more than gold behind those walls. She trained other women in weapons use, turning victims into fighters. She served as a courier, carrying intelligence between resistance cells operating in the ghetto and on the Aryan side. She helped Jews find safe havens outside the ghetto walls, forging documents, bribing guards, organizing escape routes. To maintain her cover, she worked as manager of a boarding school at Ceglana Street number 17, inside the ghetto. She balanced legitimate work with underground operations, living two completely different lives simultaneously. By day, she managed children's education in a city designed for their death. By night, she planned operations against the people who'd sealed them all behind walls. Her famous declaration captured her dual identity perfectly. I am a Jew. My place is in the struggle against the Nazis for the honor of my people and for a free Poland. She wasn't fighting just for Jewish survival. She was fighting for the Poland that had expelled her from school, that had made her life difficult for being communist and Jewish. She fought for the country that existed before the Nazis destroyed everything. On April 19, 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising erupted. The Germans planned to liquidate the remaining Jews in the ghetto, to complete the deportations to Treblinka. The Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union decided that if they were going to die, they'd die fighting. 750 Jewish fighters faced over 2,000 heavily armed German troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. Each Jewish fighter had approximately 1 pistol, 5 grenades, and 5 homemade Molotov cocktails. That's it. No machine guns, no anti-tank weapons, no artillery, no air support. They faced the most powerful military machine in the world, with weapons you could carry in your pockets. Military analysts predicted the uprising would last maybe 6 hours. It lasted 27 days. That's longer than Poland resisted the entire German invasion. That's longer than Belgium held out. That's just 9 days shorter than France's resistance to the Nazi onslaught. Niuta fought in direct combat operations during the uprising. She participated in the raid on a German machine gun position atop the ghetto walls. On April 20th, the uprising's second day, she joined a Guardia Ludowa special task force that attacked Waffen-SS soldiers at Niuta Street. This wasn't assassination work. This was open combat against professional soldiers with vastly superior weapons. The Germans couldn't believe what was happening. Jews were supposed to be weak, passive, broken. Instead, they were throwing grenades from rooftops, ambushing patrols, fighting from bunker to bunker. Nazi commanders had to call in reinforcements. They used flamethrowers to burn people out of hiding places. They systematically destroyed the ghetto building by building, turning it into a moonscape of rubble and ash. The uprising ended on May 16, 1943. The Germans claimed victory, but it was a victory that cost them. They'd expected easy deportation of starving victims. Instead, they got urban warfare that pinned down thousands of troops for nearly a month. The tactical impact was minimal. The psychological impact was enormous. Niuta survived, while the ghetto burned, while her comrades died in collapsing bunkers and burning buildings. She escaped to continue operations on Warsaw's Aryan side. For 2 more months she remained free, hunting Nazis, in a city where they thought they'd won. But on July 19, 1943, her 18 months of operational success ended. The Gestapo burst into her apartment before she could reach her poison capsule. She was 25 years old. She'd become one of the most wanted Jews in Poland. She'd killed at least 7 to 10 German personnel. She'd bombed theaters, smuggled weapons, trained fighters, and fought in the uprising. And now her luck had run out. They took her to Pawiak prison, Warsaw's notorious Gestapo facility. Thousands of Polish resistance fighters were interrogated there. Most didn't survive. The torture techniques the Gestapo employed were designed specifically to break human beings, to destroy their will, to make them betray everyone they'd ever worked with. Sources describe Niuta's treatment as bestial torture. The details weren't documented, probably because the people who inflicted it didn't want records of what they did. Weeks of brutality. Weeks of pain, designed to make her talk, to give up names, locations, operations. The Germans knew she had information they desperately wanted. She told them nothing, despite torture that broke other hardened resistance fighters. Despite weeks of physical and psychological torment, Niuta maintained absolute operational security. Not one name, not one location, not one operation. The shy blonde girl who'd fooled Nazi guards for 18 months remained unbreakable, even when there was nothing left to hide. They executed her in July 1943. The exact date wasn't recorded. The method of execution wasn't documented. Common gaps in records of that time and place, when Nazis were destroying evidence and chaos consumed Warsaw. She died at 25, the same age Mordecai Anielewicz died defending the ghetto. No final words were recorded, but her silence under torture spoke louder than any last statement could have. She died without getting the Gestapo the satisfaction of breaking her. The young woman who'd terrorized the Nazi occupation, who'd made German officers afraid in their own headquarters, who'd proven that Jewish resistance was possible even in the heart of hell, gave them nothing. For nearly 80 years, Niuta Teitelbaum's story remained buried. A few historians mentioned her briefly, a paragraph in books about the Warsaw Ghetto, a footnote in studies of resistance movements. But comprehensive accounts of what she did, who she was, and why she mattered remained absent from mainstream Holocaust history. Multiple factors created this erasure. Gender bias was enormous. Historians focused on male fighters, male commanders, male heroes. Women in resistance work were framed as support staff, as couriers and nurses, not as combat operatives and assassins. The idea that young women could be effective killers didn't fit comfortable narratives about feminine virtue and victimhood. Niuta's communist affiliation complicated things during the Cold War. Western historians were reluctant to celebrate someone who fought for the Guardia Ludova. Communist organizations were suspect. Heroes had to be the right kind of heroes, with the right political views. Niuta's declaration about fighting for a free Poland rang differently when Poland became a Soviet satellite state. Some Polish historians, including Leszek Żebrowski, questioned whether certain exploits attributed to Niuta were accurate. They suggested possible exaggeration in post-war accounts, or that the Polish Home Army's actions were later claimed by communist organizations. These questions reflect legitimate historical methodology, but they also contributed to dismissing women's resistance work as unreliable or fabricated. Language barriers kept her story inaccessible to Western audiences. Primary sources existed mainly in Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew. The 1946 anthology Women in the Ghettos documented female resistance fighters, but was never widely translated. Without English-language sources, Western historians simply ignored these accounts. If it wasn't in English, it didn't matter. The clandestine nature of assassination operations meant documentation was deliberately limited. Niuta and her comrades didn't file reports about their missions. They didn't keep records of who they killed. Creating documentation would have endangered everyone involved. Many witnesses died during the war. The Nazis destroyed records. The gaps in Niuta's biography reflect both wartime chaos and operational necessity. No information exists about her mother or siblings. Limited details about her youth. Uncertain specifics about her interrogation and death. Historians claim these gaps made her story unreliable, that without complete documentation, they couldn't trust the accounts. This standard was never applied to male resistance fighters, whose stories were told despite similar gaps. Recent scholarship has started correcting this historical amnesia. In 2021, Judy Battalion published The Light of Days, subtitled The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos. Battalion spent 12 years conducting archival research across multiple countries, uncovering stories of Jewish women fighters that had been systematically ignored. The book brought Niuta's story to mainstream audiences for the first time. It became a New York Times bestseller and has been translated into 19 languages. In November 2020, Steven Spielberg's Amblin Partners optioned the film rights, with a screenplay by Michael Mitnick and Battalion. Niuta's story might finally reach the audience it deserves. The Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel holds a 1936 photograph of Niuta as a schoolgirl in Lodz. The museum was founded on April 19, 1949 by Warsaw Ghetto Uprising survivors, making it the world's first Holocaust memorial. Yad Vashem lists her name in its database of Holocaust victims. She was posthumously awarded the Order of the Cross of Grunwald, 3rd class. Jewish historian Emanuel Ringelblum, writing in 1942 while still alive in the ghetto, recognized the significance of women like Niuta. "These heroic girls," he wrote, "they are a theme that calls for the pen of a great writer. How many times have they looked death in the eyes? The story of the Jewish woman will be a glorious page in the history of Jewry during the present war." He was right, but it took 80 years for historians to write that page. Approximately 200 women fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, out of 750 total fighters. That's more than a quarter of the combat force. They weren't auxiliary personnel. They weren't just medical staff or cooks. They were fighters who took up weapons and engaged German soldiers in direct combat. They served as couriers, the Kashariot, who moved between the ghetto and the Aryan side. This work was extraordinarily dangerous. Women had to pass through Nazi checkpoints multiple times daily, carrying forged documents, smuggling messages, weapons, money. If caught, they faced immediate execution, often after torture to reveal other resistance members. They smuggled weapons in marmalade jars and potato sacks. They hid grenades in baby carriages, pushing them past German guards who wouldn't search a woman with an infant. They purchased arms on the black market at triple normal prices, negotiating with Polish criminals and Ukrainian smugglers who'd happily sell to Jews one day and betray them to the Gestapo the next for the right price. They threw grenades from rooftops during the uprising, targeting German troops in the streets below. They commanded fighting positions, directing male fighters to defensive locations. They executed both Nazis and Jewish collaborators who betrayed their people for extra rations. In the ghetto, where starvation was a daily reality, some Jews became informers for the Germans in exchange for food. Women fighters were assigned to execute these collaborators, knowing that mercy toward traitors meant death for everyone else. Rumors spread during the uprising of a Jewish Joan of Arc clad in white, firing a machine gun from rooftops. Whether this was one specific woman or a composite of multiple fighters, the story spread through Warsaw. Germans who'd been taught that Jews were subhuman cowards suddenly faced the reality that Jewish women were killing them from concealed positions. Without women who could pass as non-Jewish and move freely through Nazi checkpoints, the resistance infrastructure would have collapsed entirely. Men couldn't serve as couriers because circumcision identified them instantly as Jewish. The entire communication network between ghetto fighters and sympathetic Poles on the outside depended on women who looked Aryan enough to move through checkpoints without triggering suspicion. Niuta's tactics worked because they exploited Nazi assumptions. Germans believed Jewish women were weak, passive victims incapable of violence. Nazi racial ideology taught that Jews were subhuman, that Jewish women were especially inferior. Her youthful, innocent appearance made her seem even less threatening. By feigning shyness and embarrassment, implying romantic or sexual vulnerability, she manipulated Nazi officers' egos and fantasies. One account describes an SS soldier addressing her as Lorelei, while admiring her blonde braids and blue eyes, thinking she was Polish. He compared her to the mythical German siren, a beautiful woman who lured men to their deaths. The irony was perfect. Seconds after calling her Lorelei, she drew her pistol and killed him. The psychological impact of her assassinations exceeded their tactical value. Each successful operation demonstrated that Nazis were vulnerable even in their own headquarters. The enormous bounty showed how seriously the Gestapo took the threat. Her exploits boosted Jewish morale at a time when hope was nearly extinct. She proved that even under total Nazi control, resistance was possible. In the ghetto, where 460,000 Jews lived in conditions designed for their death, where bodies of starvation victims lined the streets every morning, where the only question was when you'd die, not if, Niuta showed that Jews weren't just victims. They were fighters. They could strike back. They could make the occupiers afraid. The psychological warfare aspect of her operations was as important as the tactical impact. Every time a Nazi officer was found shot in his headquarters, every time a Gestapo agent died in what should have been a secure location, the Germans became more paranoid. They started questioning everyone more intensively. They became suspicious of every blonde Polish girl who approached their facilities. They increased security measures, diverted resources, assigned more guards. This created operational friction throughout their occupation administration. Resources spent hunting for Jewish assassins were resources not spent on other aspects of the occupation. Personnel assigned to increased security couldn't be deployed elsewhere. The psychological impact on German morale was measurable. Occupiers who'd felt safe in their command posts now wondered if the next young woman walking through their door was carrying a pistol under her dress. For Jews in the ghetto, Niuta's operations provided something more valuable than tactical advantage. They provided hope. When you're starving, when you're watching children die in the streets, when every morning brings news that more families are being deported to Treblinka, hope becomes the rarest commodity. Stories about little Wanda with the braids spread through the ghetto like wildfire. A Jewish girl who looked Aryan, who walked into Nazi headquarters and killed Germans, who escaped every time, who made the occupiers afraid. These stories mattered. They gave people something to hold on to in the darkest moments. They proved that resistance was possible, that Jews weren't passive victims waiting for death, that even the seemingly invincible Nazi military machine had vulnerabilities. The Germans understood the danger of these stories, which is why they put such an enormous bounty on Niuta's head. They needed to capture her not just to stop her operations, but to demonstrate that resistance was futile, that Jews who fought back would eventually be caught and killed. Niuta Teitelbaum couldn't save the 300,000 Jews murdered at Treblinka. She couldn't prevent the ghetto's destruction. The Nazis ultimately won the Battle of Warsaw, reducing the ghetto to rubble and murdering virtually all its inhabitants. But Niuta ensured that Jews didn't go passively to their deaths. She refuted Nazi propaganda about Jewish weakness. She inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. The rediscovery of Niuta's story, and the stories of hundreds of other Jewish women fighters, represents a correction decades overdue. It challenges how we understand resistance, how we define heroism, and who gets remembered as having fought back. The Warsaw Ghetto wasn't just defended by men. The resistance wasn't just male fighters with weapons. Women like Niuta were essential to every aspect of the underground, from intelligence gathering to weapons smuggling to direct assassination of Nazi personnel. Her legacy lives in the recognition that resistance took many forms, that courage wasn't limited by gender, that the young woman who looked like a farm girl could be as dangerous as any armed soldier. The Gestapo learned this lesson the hard way, hunting her for 18 months before finally capturing her. History is learning it 8 decades late, but learning it nonetheless.